The topic today is a very, very interesting one that we're going to be speaking about in this ongoing discussion about the Yoga Sutras. And so welcome to all of you for this. And it's one that actually may take two classes, in other words, because I'm wanting to make a couple of points. And the first is, you might say, a point that I'd like to make. And the second point is a discussion of what Paramhansa Yogananda said about these sutras. And I introduce it by making the statement that Yogananda, because of the second point, is we're going to be talking about something that we began to speak about last week in the question and answer period. And I jumped the gun a little bit by getting into the topic a little bit there. But Yoganandaji picks that topic up in these sutras we're going to talk about in these coming weeks. And that is the topic of Om. And he made the statement, actually, that these sutras that I'm going to cover in these today and perhaps next week, numbers 23 toward 20 into 27, are actually the most important sutras in the yogas, in Patanjali's work of the Yoga Sutras. The first couple of sutras in the Yoga Sutras are the ones that get the most attention, aren't they? The Yogaschita Vritti Narod, and now we come to the topic of yoga. These are usually the ones that's covered most extensively. But interestingly, I think that in Yoganandaji's mind, I think they took second place to the ones we're going to be speaking about today and next week. And without further ado, I'd like to read the sutras first before we begin. And I'm going to start on this is chapter 1 and number 23. And as you know, up until this point, we've been talking about yoga, the definition of yoga, the calming of the vrittis, the chitta, and then through that, a few suggestions of how to do that, detachment, one-pointed concentration, leading to a state of samadhi, the cessation of that sense of distinction, of ego identity, because as the waves calm, the sense of disunity that we feel in this universe, it begins to disappear, and we enter into a deeper state known as samadhi, that one-pointed union with the ultimate divine awareness. And then he transitions here and begins with number 23. And I'll read this through number 27. Otherwise, he's sort of countering, as you can enter in this samadhi, over the ways that he's discussed detachment and concentration and so forth. Otherwise, through devotion and complete self-offering to God, this higher samadhi can be attained. Number 24, Ishvara is the supreme self, unaffected by any affliction, karmic action, consequence thereof, or impression of desires. Number 25, in him is fully developed the seed of omniscience. Number 26, unconditioned by time, he is the supreme instructor of even the most ancient of teachers. And finally, number 27 for this morning or this evening, the expression of Ishvara is the hidden sound of Om. Now, as I mentioned, Yoganandaji said that these are extremely important sutras, and considered, he even said, the most important. Particularly this importance of Om. And I'd like to speak about that, as I said, eventually, but I want to start with an observation that I've had, which you might see this first point, and to go into this a little bit deeper today. As I said, up to now, Patanjali has been explaining what is needed to achieve samadhi, to overcome our sense of identification, to duality. And then he goes on and says, otherwise, immersion of ourselves, surrender to ourselves into God, self-transcendence into God is going to lead us to this divine state of samadhi. Swami says God in this translation here, the way he translates it in his book, but in the Sanskrit, Patanjali uses the word Ishwara, and this also word is used in Swami uses as well. And I think it's important. If we stand back, it's important that Patanjali brings this up at this juncture. He says, here's what we can do to attain the state of samadhi. And then he introduces this again, which let me read it just once more, number 23, because it is very important. He says, oh, where is it? There it is. Through devotion and complete self-offering to God, this higher samadhi can be attained. And so he here introduces devotion to God, immersion of ourselves, surrender to that. And I think this is important for us to discuss because he brings this up at this point I think, to give some emphasis to it. And Patanjali uses the word Ishwara, and Ishwara you could say God, yes, but that word God has a certain tendency in many people's minds to say, oh, I don't believe in God. I'm not, that's not for me. And it causes a lot of reactions in people. Or if they say, yes, I do believe in God, and then they proceed to define it in certain ways. And there are as many definitions of God as there are devotees, because each one coming up with their own definition. And unfortunately, when you have that approach, it's God is this, God is that, it tends to create division. No, God's not that, he's this. My God is this, your God is that. And that, of course, is a ridiculous way to approach something that is transcendental. And what Patanjali uses the word Ishwara, he's speaking about an ideal of transcendental, untouched, absolute pure awareness, universal consciousness, or as Swami Shankaracharya would say, ever new bliss. And he's speaking it in this way that encompasses every possible definition of that, whereas to start to divide and inevitably it brings up in people's minds a certain amount of conflict with my view, your view, and so on. And there is, of course, an ancient teaching, which we must keep in mind. God cannot be defined. It's beyond definition. As soon as you come up with a definition, usually you put limitations. So it's beyond that. But yet, we're going to use this word Ishwara here, because that's what Patanjali used. This transcendental, untouched, absolute pure awareness. And why is it important that this is brought up at this point? Or what you might say, why do I think it's important? Because it's because in the teaching of yoga, today, there is a question that comes up that can yoga be taught without the inclusion of God? And this is, of course, a topic that's current today in society because yoga is making its way into all corners of society. And there's some reaction against it as a spiritual, it's a religious teaching, it's a foreign teaching, it's against my beliefs. And and so consequently, many people approach yoga from, you might say, excising or cutting out the concept of a divine or God, or the concept of a universality or Ishvara. Or they find it awkward to talk about these subjects in the context of speaking about yoga. And so I think it's worth addressing that so that we have an understanding of what is being spoken about here. And there's a second reason, and I'm going to come back to that, but there's a second reason also that I feel it's important to speak about this at this point, because yoga does have a hidden danger. And I intimated that a little bit last week in the question and answer period. Because what is it? What is the goal of yoga? It's to dissolve the sense of separate identification. Ultimately, that's a divine reality that we're trying to attune ourselves with. But interestingly, it can also, as we do that, it brings up this question of ego, this sense of we begin to gain a certain something as we practice yoga. We begin to gain a certain control over ourselves. We begin to be, from being scattered in our thinking, we begin to learn to concentrate. We begin to gain a control over ourselves, our reaction, the reactive process, and that control strengthens that sense, can strengthen, does not necessarily need to, but it can strengthen the sense that I am the doer. Look, I'm being able to do all these things. And you see this sometimes in the people who practice yoga. They get a certain pride that comes. I can lift myself into the state of samadhi, maybe even there. And you see practitioners of yoga becoming a little bit self-centered in that way. And because they have something, and they do, they have a certain strength that comes. But if I say I can lift myself into samadhi, the emphasis in that approach of I-ness, I am the doer, the emphasis is on myself, you see. And we have to be careful, because when we become proficient at anything, and here we're speaking about self-control, my reactive process, but it could also be some worldly task. We become very proficient, and we've got a little bit proud of that. Isn't that so? And this, of course, brings up limitations in ourselves, and we end up actually setting ourselves for a great deal of suffering in the long run, because that's a blockage. And the more we strengthen that blockage, the more difficult it is to get rid of it. And also, it's like the bandage that's on very tightly on your arm, perhaps. When you pull it off, the tighter it is, the more painful it is to take that bandage off. And it's inimical, because we think we're striving very hard, but yet we have to surrender. And we tend to think of those two things as opposites, that my striving sometimes can leave out the concept of the need to surrender. And people sometimes will think that those two things are on opposite sides of the scale, but they are not. You work hard at what you do at yoga so that you can surrender, to give you the power to be able to let go. And Patanjali reminds us, by bringing up this concept here of Ishwara, that there is something larger than our little ego selves. We must work hard to remember the larger context in which we strive. So you could say yoga is, we're trying to surrender, but to what? Surrender to something. And so we have to keep that in mind when we're practicing our yoga, the necessity to surrender to a higher power. I like to look at it in one way. We have to remember, when we think of yoga, we think of the spiritual quest as, and it's often brought up, the ascent, you might say, of a mountain. And of course, whenever you ascend, the effort is required. It's easy to roll downhill. It doesn't take much effort to go downhill. But to go upward, it does take effort and that's the self-effort that we make in our ascent on the spiritual path. But where that image falls short is that, yes, it's easy to roll downhill because of the force of gravity. You see, this world is created, there is a force. Again, something that many don't like to acknowledge because it seems old-fashioned, but there is a truth to the fact that there is a force that pulls us into immersion, Maya, you could say, Satan, if you wish, this force. and it's the creative force. Without that force, when this universe was created, when this cosmos was created, whatever's beyond the cosmos, it went out, and it keeps this Maya, this world, in existence. If there wasn't that outward force of creation pushing outward, everything perhaps would be dissolved back in to its origin. So there is this outward force that pulls us outward, and this is, of course, represented in most religions. Is it's even personified in religions. Maya is a goddess, or Satan's in this is a devil. But they represent a cosmic reality, and that's gravity. You might even say, to the image of this ascent on the mountain. There's gravity pulling us in the other direction. But we forget in our quest of climbing that mountain that there is also, where there is a pull or push or force in one direction, there's also inevitably, and you might say originally, a counterforce pulling us back to creation. Has a counterforce pulling us back to divine unity. And these two forces are at play on a cosmic, metaphysical level, you could say, mystical level, these dueling forces. And so consequently, the ego, that pull of Maya into creation, we strengthen our own sense of self-will in order to struggle against that, just to make the ascent to that mountain. As we get along on that path, we sometimes forget that there's also a force in creation itself that is pulling us back in the other direction. Cosmic love, you might want to call it, or you might say it's a divine force, God's divine mother's hand reaching down, pulling us up. And to climb that mountain simply by our own power, without reaching up, to attune ourselves to that power that is going in the upward direction, cannot be done to the degree that we strengthen egoically that self-will. The stronger we make the ego, used in the wrong way, actually separates us from that. Used in the right way, we then recognize that higher power and we attune ourselves to that higher power, which is moving. It's God's love, you could say, speaking devotionally. It's God's love, that power that pulls us back. And it's also, you could say that it's also that force of creation that has gone out into the world at large, can be said to be that cosmic force, creative force of Om. Om is the outward flowing power out into the world. And you could say outward Maya is a form of that, because it's outwardly flowing. But that Om is also an expression of divine love. And we attune to the upward part of that, the upward flow, by listening, by attuning ourselves to that cosmic power of God's hand reaching down. It's God's hand, Divine Mother, reaching down to uplift us. And so we have to remember that. And so when the question comes up, is yoga necessary, or is God necessary, the concept of God necessary to practice yoga properly? And of course, it's a difficult question. And the answer, yes or no. You could say it's both yes and no, because the concept of yoga in the world today is identified with physical activities of asana. Perhaps people will extend it to breathing exercises or mudras or some sort of practice that I can do. And one doesn't necessarily need to have a concept of Ishvara or a concept of divinity in order to practice that. You can do those perfectly well. And they promise a certain benefit. You become calm, become peaceful, can become more happy and joyful. All of these things are possible with the practice outwardly, without any inclusion of divinity. But to paraphrase something Swami said about do we need a guru? You could say Swami could have said that. Do you need to believe in God or some higher power? And no, you don't need to, and you need to believe in those things unless you want to attain liberation. Liberation in this sense means transcendence above the ego. And if you want to attain that, then yes, there needs to be a realization, and more than a realization plus an infusion of that concept that reflects in our attitudes of our approach to reality. So long as we have a dualistic view of reality, and by dualism, I mean so long as we're in ego consciousness, I and thine, or I am different from you, I am separated. So long as we live in that consciousness, we cannot comprehend the absolute. They are different. And that's something larger, that's beyond the ego, pure consciousness, oneness, divine unity, another word for love. All of those things are embodied when we use the word Ishvara, or in modern context, they're embodied in the concept of God. But God without that divisiveness that comes. And I like to use, and I've maybe brought this up in these classes already. If I haven't, I've done it in other words. I like to use that image of the little flame on the burner. You have the burner, the cooking stove, and you look at it and you see it's made up of maybe 100 little sparks, flames jets coming up. But you look underneath the burner and you see it's just one flame. And when you could say yoga truly understood is not to exalt those little flames above the burner on the top. I'm the biggest flame of all 100 of us here. But instead, is to realize that I'm just a jet, just a spark of that underlying flame. And that flame, that underlying gas flame under the burner, is what Patanjali speaks of as the goal of when we calm the vrittis. That's what we attain, union with that universal flame that's under there. And in order to do that, we have to surrender, you might say, that strong ego force within us becomes strong so that we can then surrender it and merge ourselves into that. And then this effort of self-offering, it's an ongoing, it's not something we attain so much that now I have it, now I don't. It's an ongoing attitude, not just a one-time effort. It's an attitude of devotional surrender to the larger reality of which we are part. And this is extremely necessary as a part of yoga in the larger framework of what yoga means. And so, yes, there needs to be this recognition of there is something greater than our little self when we practice yoga to do it rightly. There is something with which to merge into beyond the little self. And so the answer is yoga necessary is God necessary for proper understanding? I'd say yes, it is. But if it makes people uncomfortable, I think maybe, because for whatever reason, that word God seems to bother some people. Think in terms of divine bliss. Think in terms of Sat Chitananda. Or think in terms of Ishvara, divine light, these larger transcendental qualities. And I would say, if it bothers you, I'd say introspect. Why? Why should any concept bother anybody? And if that anybody is us, it means that we have to think about that and release whatever prejudices we might have one way or the other, because there is something beyond the little self into which we are trying to merge that consciousness. And that if we take it to the next step, not only is there something, but that something is a power that is attractive and is actually, it's a cosmic power, a cosmic reality, a river, you might say, that is gently, very, very gently attracting us back to our divine origin, our divine reality of who and what we truly are. And you could say another word for that might be even be using the word of grace. It's a river of grace into which we have to offer ourselves, and use whatever word works for you. But we're here, as Patanjali uses the word Ishvara. And so consequently, he introduces, I think it's important at this point for us to understand, he has introduced this word at this part so that we, as we're now progressing in our understanding, he's reminding us that there's a greater reality of which we are but a part. And the ego self, the development of that is not the pinnacle. It's not the pinnacle. And of course, Ishvara is an expression here. It is the expression of and then the expression of Ishvara, he goes on to say, and that's number 27, which I read, that expression of Ishvara, when that Ishvara creates this universe, expresses this universe, you might say, manifests this universe, is Om. He's using that word Om. He uses the word Om is the expression of Ishvara in this reality, this world in which we find ourselves. But Om is a conscious, creative force of manifestation, God's force of manifestation. It's not an inert something. There's consciousness to it. And this is why Shankara uses that word, ever existent, ever conscious. Our master actually added the word ever, existence, consciousness, and master added bliss, or ever new, to what Shankara said was bliss, ever new, ever existent, ever conscious, ever new bliss. And so we're going to come back to this. Now, I mentioned this now because it's going to be a subtext as we progress through the Yoga Sutras. We're going to come back to it when we discuss the Yamas and Niyamas. And I think many of you have studied those. And one of those niyamas is loosely translated. It's usually the fifth of the niyamas, devotion to the Supreme, or devotion to the Supreme Lord. And it's often something that those who practice yoga from a non-devotional perspective, they feel uncomfortable with that. Because, why does Patanjali have to bring in this God concept? And this is not something that just modern society is at. This is an ancient discussion but there is Patanjali, the Yoga Sutras, and Patanjali's Yoga Sutra without God and with God. And it's been debated back and forth what Patanjali was intending. And many have rejected that aspect of Patanjali, but I think it's there. And so I don't think it's there casually, and it's there for a reason. And we have to introspect within ourselves to understand. We must develop qualities. And he's saying here in the niyamas, we'll come back to this again later, but briefly, he's saying this is what you must do. You must have these niyamic qualities, purity, contentment, tapasya, and so on. He says, essentially, we have to develop, when he comes here, this fifth one, devotion to the Supreme, we must develop the qualities of a seeker in the practice of yoga. Yoga is not just I'm doing this. We have to approach it in that attitude. I am the seeker. And in that attitude of openness, that attitude of receptivity is embodied also the attitude of the chela, the disciple. And so this is, we're going to come back to that. And with that attitude, we approach the study of yoga. And that sense here again, Swami or Patanjali says self-offering in the face of this awesomeness of this concept of Ishvara. We must offer. All rivers, great and small, must eventually lose themselves into that ocean. Now I'm going to wrap up here because this concept is so important itself. It demands its own class without going on to this topic of Om right now. But I'll just end with a little story, an experience of something Swami Kriyananda once said to me. I had written a letter. I was, as part of our Ananda tradition, we teach various techniques to people who are interested in learning the science of Kriya Yoga. And one of those techniques is learning to listen to the sound of Om. And he said, and so I had written a letter to Swami Kriyananda. He said, generally the practice is give Om to somebody who is a disciple of our path. Don't just give Om willy-nilly out to anybody, but give it to people who are sincere, who are disciples of the path. But I had asked him because I had come. So some people, they were sincere, but they were not yet dedicated to our path, particularly as disciples of Paramhansa Yogananda, particularly. And so I said, well, they too want to progress, but they're not ready to make that jump yet to become a disciple of this particular path of which we are, Kriya path. And I said, can I not give it to them? And he answered me back. He says, well, yeah, I understand what you're saying. He says, use your judgment. He says, basically he was saying, I've been on this path long enough, teaching long enough that I should have some discrimination, he hoped. He said, use your judgment, but understand what he was trying to say. And because I had asked him previously, I says, can I give Kriya Yoga initiation to someone who's not a disciple of this path of Paramhansa Yogananda? And again, Swami, he said, well, if somebody, he says, use your judgment. He says, yes, if somebody's sincere, if somebody loves Master, who's the guru of this path, the guru of this, what we're representing here of Kriya Yoga, but yet perhaps that person has another guru, but yet they're sincere, they love Master, and it will help them. He said, use your judgment. The answer is yes, but use your judgment. Do they have the qualities that are necessary, whether it's our guru or some other guru? And so I took that, and that's what, in that context, I asked him about the second question about teaching Om also. And he said, use your judgment, but then he qualified it. He says, but don't give Kriya, or don't give the Om technique, don't to somebody who's an atheist. That's what he left it at that. Now, what did he mean by that? He said, don't reveal these techniques to somebody who has no love for God, who has, and now that use of the word God gets us in trouble because people, and this person that I was thinking of had a very false notion of what God, his concept was, and thought of it in very old-fashioned terms. He said, I can't believe that. I said, well, there's alternatives, that, usually those old-fashioned terms had a very limiting idea, but God is something can't be limited. God is something much, much beyond that. And so we had this discussion came up more than once with people, is to help them to break free from this idea of limitation, that God is transcendental, universal, is God's our very own higher self. God's that spark of light within each one of us, of which we're trying to remove that cocoon or that of ignorance that allows us to realize that. And, I in a bit, but the point, one of the points Swami was making, a person had to be strong enough to be able to accept that possibility of that before he felt that I should give them the techniques. If they were just solidly, no, I reject, he said, giving them techniques is not going to help them. They have to soften their heart first to allow for the possibility of something larger. And so you might say because a person who self-defines themselves as an atheist basically has just assumed a new religion. They become firm. They become blocked in their ability to think beyond that. I think it's much more honest if a person, or much more useful, maybe I better say it that way, much more useful for a person to graduate from becoming an atheist to becoming a agnostic, I guess is the right word. I don't know, but I'm open to the possibility. And when that stage is reached, then you have a possibility of reaching. And God actually has the possibility of reaching down to us. But as long as we keep that cocoon, that hardness, no, cannot be. This world is of materialism, the firm reality, and everything else is fantasy. You hear people say that, and where we should realize that everything else is not fantasy. It's the idea that we are separate, that this world of Maya, that is the reality. That is the fantasy. And it's backward. And so we come to that. And of course, those of us who share these teachings, we have to go gently and appropriately to reach people with the idea that there's a larger reality out there beyond that which I know, and to at least be open to it. And I think that's the attitude we have to have when we practice yoga. And yoga should not deny that. Many people, when they say, is yoga a spiritual practice or a religious practice? It may not be religious, but it certainly is spiritual. And to deny that and say, no, it's just exercises, I think is doing ourselves a disservice. And it's also doing a disservice to Patanjali and to the line of teachings that have been passed down to us from ancient times. So I'm going to leave it there at that this week. And I see there's some questions here, and I'll answer them. How long is today's session? I don't know. We've gone 40 minutes, so we've gone quite a long time already. That wasn't. That was, I see, Bar answered that. Is there a difference between Ishvara and Bhagwan? I don't think so. But of course, it depends on how people define these things. And see, this is where we get into trouble. We define things. This is, that is not. And that's where we start to get into debate of these things. But I think in essence, no, there is not. And of course, each of these words evoke different concepts in people's minds. But I think in essence, I would say no. And also the second part of that question, is it okay to pray to multiple deities? I think that's perfectly fine. Long as we understand, of course, that all deities are representations of a universal ideal. You see, it's the ideal. And no one, Ishvara, Allah, Bhagavan, they're all, you could say, windows onto a universal reality. And this little mind, this little intellect cannot encompass. And so we have to look through our own little windows. But where we get into trouble is say, well, my window is better than your window over there. or is the correct, the only window. I think all of you can understand and know that. And I'm sure all of you have probably run into that at one point or another. So next week, let's take up this next half of what we introduced this week of, what is the expression of Ishvara is Om. Until then, thank all of you very much for your patience and your attendance today. God bless all of you. Joy to you.